Welcome back to part 2 of the very first Ask Me Anything for Relative Time. Now, if you happen to have missed the first part, I'll have a link down below in the description, and I suggest you check that out if for no other reason to understand why I'm actually doing all of this. Now, that said, let's get back to it. Number 25. How long on average does it take you to produce a video? On average, I'd say it's close to about 15 hours per video. And let me stress that my way is not efficient, and my way is not one that I would recommend. If you look around, there are probably much easier ways to do a video than what I'm doing here. It's hard to say because sometimes I do the photography in batches, but I'd say I probably spend about 3 hours per watch on just the photography. And after that's when I really wear it just to get a sense of it. And after I do that, I kind of sit down and write something that's kind of the cross between an outline and a script, which is where I really collect my thoughts and also where I spend way too much time thinking and sometimes overthinking what I want to say, is I usually spend kind of around 3 hours doing this. And in the future, that's something I do want to try and streamline. Once I kind of have that done, I then go to record my thoughts. Sometimes I do kind of the intro and the outro in front of the camera, and then I do the rest of it as voiceover. And every once in a while, I do everything kind of in front of the camera like this. It just sort of depends. But either way, that usually takes around an hour just to get everything I need for about a 15-minute video. Now, if I'm doing kind of like I'm doing here, where it's just straight video and the audio is going straight into the camera, I jump straight into editing. But if I do kind of a voiceover thing and it's just an audio file, I usually spend about another 30 minutes just sort of clipping that and editing it so that it's nice and kind of streamlined to import into the video editor. Now, video editing is the longest part by far, and that's just because I'm putting all these different pieces together. Doing this, I usually spend about 6 to 8 hours per video. It really kind of depends on the length of the video, how focused I am, as well as maybe how often I get interrupted by puppies. But once it's rendered, I'm still not completely finished. At that point, I try to watch the video from start to finish, just to make sure there are no glaring, video or editing mistakes that I missed. If there is, I kind of go back and fix them and re-render it. But say the video's good, I then upload it to YouTube, at which point I then make a thumbnail and then finish the description. And that last part takes maybe 30 minutes to an hour. So all in all, probably close to 15 hours on average per video. Ideally, maybe going in the future, I'd like to cut that down to about 10. But if I do that, I want to do it in a way that really doesn't sacrifice the quality or the kind of videos you guys expect. Number 26 is sort of a follow-up to that, asking about the time to make a video and the workflow, but also asking what gear I'm using to create these. And this comes from RemoteCon 1980, and I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to make a shameless plug. And that's because early last month, I wound up setting up an Amazon store for the channel. Other channels have these, so you've probably seen them, but they're just a collection of affiliate links of products that I like and that I'd recommend. But on that store, there is actually a section for camera and audio equipment that I use. Although it's not entirely a shameless plug because that's probably the quickest way of seeing what I'm using. And if you have any questions beyond that, you can always just email me or direct message me and I can tell you kind of my experiences with them. But beyond that, just to kind of give you a short list, the main camera I use is a Panasonic Lumix G85. And with that, I'm usually using the kit lens or the macro lens that Panasonic sells. It's a great overall camera to do this kind of stuff, but there is one glaring and annoying issue with it, and that's that its autofocus completely sucks when it's doing video. In the past, when I was using it and I was kind of down in my office, I was never quite sure if it was focusing on me or the background or what, and it always just drove me crazy. So a secondary camera that I'm using, and I'm using right now, is a Sony ZV-1. Now, this is a point-and-shoot camera, but it's a pretty good point-and-shoot camera that was designed for YouTube creators. I didn't really want to buy a whole other camera, but I just happened to find a really good deal on an open box one and decided to give it a shot. And it's actually worked out really well because it really complements this one, which is the Panasonic, because it's a small point and shoot camera. So there's a lot of things it can't do for the watch reviews, but it has fantastic autofocus and it's just simple, easy to use. I just put it on this little mount here and it works perfect. The only complication with it is that it is pretty power hungry with its batteries and it can get pretty hot. In terms of audio, what I've used in the past was a Rode Lav mic that I'd wear when I was in front of the camera. And then I had a Blue Yeti condenser mic that I have kind of set up in a closet as a makeshift sound booth. Although, really recently, I bought this Rode NTG shotgun mic and I mounted it on this little arm up here. So it's just kind of out of the camera frame shot. Really impressed with this one. I've only had it for a couple of weeks. This is the second video I've wound up using it, but I think it actually sounds just as good as that condenser mic. So I might just wind up using this from now on and doing more stuff in front of the camera. Number 27. When is the next Collection Conundrum episode? That's a good question, and I'm not 100% sure on that. They're always fun to do, so I'm up for one when I can. The trick is trying to find a good time where the three of us can get together. Plus, it's not just our schedule, but also finding a guest and finding a time that they can come in to join us. We were talking about doing one last month as sort of Thanksgiving episode, but the timing just didn't work. We're currently talking about maybe doing one the end of this month, close to New Year's, but we'll see. If that doesn't work, then probably looking more at mid-January. Number 28. What's your favorite watch that everyone else thinks is horrible? Well, that's kind of a fun one. This may surprise some new subscribers, but I'd say Shinola. And now that I've lost those new subscribers, let me explain why. Shinola has a pretty polarizing reputation, and especially among watch enthusiasts. But I think a lot of that is because watch enthusiasts, or at least a lot of them, don't really understand the point behind Shinola. They don't seem to understand that Shinola really isn't making watches for watch collectors and enthusiasts. Rather, they're making watches for everyday people. For the people that have no interest in becoming watch geeks, who just want a nice quality watch. And that means their primary focus is using quartz movements, not automatics. One of the things that bothers me with this too is that some of the most vocal people against Shinola are people who've probably never even seen a Shinola. Now, I actually currently have two, one of which is this Filson sub brand. And this thing is kind of a cross between a field watch and a diver, and it just has Lume for days. And then I have this Disney Mickey crossover with Shinola that's based on a Runwell. And at the moment, I'd say it's probably one of the best Mickey watches out there. My wife also has a smaller Runwell, and this is a watch she absolutely loves. It's pretty much perfect for her. Like I've said before, she has no interest in an automatic, but she does still want a nice watch, and that's exactly what this is. Overall, I found them to be really solid, well made watches. It's just that the trick is that they're really overpriced, solid, well made watches. Now, you take that crazy price that they're trying to sell some of these for, as well as the fact that they're mostly quartz watches, and for whatever reason, that just seems to send some people over the edge and fill them with hate when they see the brand. Now, the thing is, I would never recommend you buy Shinola at full retail price. If you do, you're just absolutely crazy. But the thing is, Shinola is trying to be a bigger brand, even though they're not, and they are backed with some rather deep pockets. So they make a fair amount of watches, enough that eventually some of them make it to the clearance section. And when they go on clearance, that's actually when they're rather reasonable to buy. Anyway, number 29. What company makes the best watch with terrible or no lume? There are probably quite a few, but a couple do come to mind immediately. One of which I just happened to buy, and that's this Trebus TR01. If you're not familiar with the brand, it's basically what Christopher Ward did after he cashed out of the actual Christopher Ward brand. It's a very cool watch and pretty pricey if you're paying full retail, but the lume on this thing just sucks. Another watch that I know about is actually my Hamilton Intramatic chronograph. Love this watch, but again, lume is absolutely horrible. And the last one that I can think of, and this might top them all, is some of the original Longines Conquest. This is my Conquest, and this one's actually pretty decent. But if I'm remembering right, some of the original Conquests had lume on the dial, but no lume on the hands, which pretty much made them useless. Number 30, and this comes from my buddy Edwin. What is your ultimate Grail watch, and what is the one watch that you will never get rid of? Grail watch is kind of tricky. The thing is, my watch collecting is really tied into this channel, and this channel is kind of a documentation of my own horological journey. And since the channel is really focused on affordable watches, that's kind of where I've kept my focus. I've never really looked beyond and never really looked at luxury level watches. Recently, though, I have been starting to think about it, but I've still not necessarily laser focused in on anything. So, in terms of ultimate grail, like completely unattainable kind of grail, I'd say the original Explorer 2, the one with the non Mercedes hands and the really funky design. Although, if you're talking maybe new and not necessarily vintage, then maybe a Royal Oak. But the thing is, I don't ever really expect to buy any of those. I mean, even if the funds were readily available, I'm kind of far too practical to actually do it. At least I think I am. When it comes to money, I'm definitely not frugal, but I would say I'm practical and rather practical when it comes to numbers like these. So when you're talking like 30 or 60 grand for a watch, to me, I'm more thinking about how that should be invested so I can retire early. And I think I would rather retire early and travel than, say, sit at home with a Royal Oak on my wrist. As for the other question, that's actually kind of hard, just like narrowing it down to one watch I'd never sell, or like if I could only ever keep one watch. Uh, just because I do have a couple of things that are really hard to ever replace, like say the Akura Wayfinder prototype. I think there's only a handful of those in the world, and it is something I really love. But if I really had to narrow it down just to one, I'd probably say my Hamilton Intramatic. Mostly because it's my first real Grail watch and it's one I've obsessed over the longest. I'd say that one, even if it isn't necessarily the most practical. So, number 31, we have a very similar question from my affordable watch collection, but he also asked if I would exchange that for my ultimate Grail watch. And the answer is an absolutely emphatic yes. I love this watch, but you're talking about like a $1,500 watch versus like a $60,000 watch. So it's kind of a no brainer in that regard. And, you know, even though I love it, it's not necessarily overly sentimental, and it is fairly easy to replace at the moment. Number 32, we also had a similar question about Grail watches, as well as if I were to design a timepiece, what would be the essential features? This is something I've thought about a few times, even though I doubt I'd ever actually go make my own watch. But basically, if I were to design a watch, it would be kind of a cross between an Explorer 2 and an Alpinist. Basically a GMT Alpinist. It's something I've never seen, and it combines GMTs and field watches, which are two of my favorite types of watches. Number 33, can you make content about the best solar machine watches and maybe the problems with each, as well as how long do you have to replace their battery? I'll have to look into it a little bit more and maybe try to put something out. Although these days, I think most solar watches are fairly equivalent to each other. I do have some questions about maybe who has the better long term battery, but I think that's kind of hard to say and even harder to test out. Because I think right now, with most solar watches, you should expect at least 10 years and maybe even 20 with the battery that came with the watch. I can say that I have a solar watch that's over 20 years old and it's still working fine. The battery capacity is probably not what it used to, but as long as it regularly gets some sunlight, it's working perfect. So I think the bigger question when it comes to solar powered watches is whether or not you really want to keep it around for 20 years. Number 34, can you recommend $1,000 and $2,000 collections from watches released in 2021? If you're talking about an entire collection in that price range, I might be able to do kind of a video on that later on. But if you're talking about like specific new watches in that price range, I don't think I can really help you. Like I've mentioned before, my focus has always been on more affordable watches, so kind of under that $1,000 price category. And some of the more nicer, expensive watches that have been released this year are kind of over that $2,000 cap. Like some of the things that are going on over at Tudor, as well as the new Oris 400 movement. Question number 35. What other YouTube wristwatch reviewers do you recommend? Well, I obviously have to say Dave from Just the Watch and Alton from Half Past Blog, just because I do the Collection Conundrum game show with both of them. And Dave especially is really killing it right now. I think he's really up to cinematography editing game. But there are a lot of good channels out there, and almost too many to mention, and there's new ones every day. I think the key to finding a good channel to watch is to really find one that has a style you enjoy watching, and that's something that's really hard to recommend. But you also want to try and find someone who seems really real and authentic in terms of what they're talking about. And ideally, you also want to find someone who actually spends a fair amount of time with the watch itself, rather than just flip the camera on as soon as they get it. Jody, I think, is an obvious recommendation. I think he may be one of the best all around reviewers out there. Whereas if you're looking more into luxury level watches, Adrian from Bark and Jack is also good. And personally, I'm always amazed at just how casual and relaxed he looks on camera, despite the copious amount of caffeine he's consuming. Oleg from 24 Hours at a Time is also good, as well as Miguel from SoCal Watch Reviews and his buddy Ross. If you happen to love Casios and G-Shocks, then Watch Geek is a great channel to go to as well. Now, if you're looking for something a little funny and maybe a little different, it's hard to beat Minute Watch. There's also Watch Up 69, and he's actually one of my oldest reviewer friends that I met on YouTube. He's always doing things a bit different, and I think he may be the only reviewer out there who made kind of an avant garde style review. Then there's also a really small channel I've come across called Smooth Watch Reviews, who's making really smooth reviews. I'm sure I'm forgetting some people, but that's just a start, and I'll try to pin a comment down below with some links to those channels as well as a few others. Number 36 from Cat and Morgan. How many watches do you have and how much are they worth in total? And I'll answer part of that. I'm not really going to get into the value side of it because I honestly don't know and I honestly don't want to know. I mean, no addict really wants to know the extent of their problem. That is just going to take far too long to just sit down and figure out. If you want to get into more details, I will do a state of the collection in a couple of months. Not entirely sure when. I just got to find a good time to do it. So, for how many I have a lot. I have just over 100 in the house right now. I think maybe 106. And I'm the first person to say it. That is way too many. Now, there are a couple of things to note here. One of which that this does include watches I've reviewed and I haven't sold yet, but I plan to. As I talked about earlier, I used to sell stuff on eBay, and I'm not really happy with how that works right now. So I'm looking for alternatives. And that also includes some watches that I keep around just because of the channel. I think if I ever stopped doing it, there are a number of those that I would sell. Mainly, I keep them around just to be able to compare things to. It was a little out of hand during my last state of the collection, and now it's completely out of hand. So, one of my goals for this next year is to kind of clean this up and maybe streamline it at least a little, as well as really think about what's my core collection versus what I'm keeping around just for the channel, and then maybe physically separate those out just so I have a better idea. Because right now, everything is just sort of intermingled in a big jumble mess. Number 37. What have you sold that you regret, and what have you regretted buying or keeping? So, I've only regretted buying a couple of watches, and luckily they've been on the less expensive side, so it was never really out a lot of money. The first one is actually one of the first automatic watches I ever bought. It was this kind of weird skeletonized Invicta that I'm sure had some off brand Chinese movement in it. I bought it because I didn't necessarily know any better, and I bought it on a cruise ship just because I was interested, and they told me it was like 70 or 80% off. And again, I didn't really know any better because I didn't really know about Invictas that much, and since I was on a cruise ship, I couldn't really look up anything. It wasn't until I got home that I started researching some stuff and found out I paid probably twice as much as I should have. And that's actually one of the driving things that got me to start learning more about watches and watching more YouTube channels about watches, just so that wouldn't happen again. The second watch was this kind of vintage Frankenwatch Seiko that I picked up off eBay. At the time, I was looking for a really small diver for my wife, and these are actually really hard to find. So, just looking around for something, happened to find this old restored Seiko on eBay, bought it, and it was a total lemon. The exterior actually looks good, but the movement in it is crap. I think it's running like 2 minutes fast a day. At some point, I might try to fix it myself just for a learning experience, but kind of just sitting around right now. Although it did help me to discover that my wife has absolutely no interest in automatic watches, and I've never tried to buy her another one. As for selling, there are definitely a couple there that I regret. The first of which was the Baby Ice Monster. I love that watch, and I sold it with the idea that I'd eventually replace it with the Seiko Frost Monster. But I sold it, and then I looked at the price of the Frost Monsters, thought it was too high, and thought I'd wait a little bit for that price to drop, which it never did. Then the price of the Ice Monsters started going up as well. So I kind of screwed myself on that front, but in the end, I think it did work out because I'm pretty happy with the Antarctica Seiko Monster. The second watch I really regret selling was the Vostok Reef GMT, and that was that weird one with a dual bezel system where you had this exterior normal bezel and then an interior bezel as well. Very different, very unusual, and I sold it because I'm a complete idiot. I regretted it instantly, and I've just been waiting for Marinome to get more in stock so I can buy another. Number 38. What are your strap preferences and any recommended suppliers? I'll keep this one short because I am planning on doing a state of the strap collection video. I was actually planning to do it over Thanksgiving, but I wound up hurting my hand a little bit. Nothing serious. It just kind of had a scratch and had this big old scab. So I figured no one really wanted to watch me handle straps and look at the scab or even a big band-aid. So that's still on the agenda. I'm just not sure when I'm going to get around to it. I think I am going to try to do that before I do a normal state of the collection, though. But a short list right now is that for great budget friendly straps, I'd look at Ritchie on Amazon. Then there's also Barton, which is one of my favorite strap manufacturers, and Ritchie actually winds up copying Barton a lot. They're a little bit more, but not too much, but they have just great all around straps. And lastly, check out Vario. They have a lot of great unusual straps you won't find anywhere else, and their prices are usually pretty good. Number 39. I never noticed Einstein's equation in your logo. Makes me curious what your day job is. I'm seeing gears, chemistry, equations that turn matter into energy, or vice versa. My question is, why isn't there a theory of quantum gravity yet? This comes from Neff, and I was not expecting a quantum physics question with all this. It's not quite in my scope or my experience to talk about this. As a chemist, I did study PChem, which is the physics side of chemistry, and that does deal with some quantum physics stuff, but I'm definitely not a theoretical physicist. That's kind of outside my area of expertise, but if I had to give you an answer, and maybe this is kind of a cop out because it's maybe more philosophical than anything, I'd say it's probably because we don't have all the pieces of the puzzle yet, that there are things we don't quite fully understand yet. For me, physics is really just the study of trying to understand reality through mathematical equations, basically creating mathematical representations or models of reality. When you're talking classical physics, it's a little more easier to figure things out. Like, say, when you throw a ball up in the air and you want to chart its trajectory, you can kind of see it, you can understand it, and if your equation isn't working out, you may be able to see that there's some sort of variable that's missing. Whereas with quantum physics, you're dealing with things we can't see and things where even the brightest among us can barely comprehend what it's all about. So maybe there are just some fundamental truths out there that we have yet to even grasp. Number 40. How much do you spend on watches annually for the past 3 years, average? They say there are no bad questions, but Michael, this is a bad question because, like I said before, no one really wants to understand the true extent of their obsession. Because I really don't want to know. But because I said I'd answer questions, I did look into it. Although, before I get to that, there are a couple of things I think that are important to note here. First off, like I've said a few times, my watch collecting budget is directly tied to the channel. When I started this whole thing, I kind of started it with the idea of it being a self funding hobby, and that I was really going to limit my collection to what revenue comes out of the channel. And for the most part, I have kept up with that. And that's also why I haven't really started buying more expensive watches until the last couple of years. The second thing is that when I sell a watch, the funding from that sale goes directly into buying another watch, especially when I'm buying something nicer that I expect to keep. At that point, I kind of look in the collection and think about what I haven't worn recently and what may have a similar feel to what I'm looking at buying. For example, when I jumped on the Second Hour Mandala Kickstarter, I sold two watches. I sold the Second Hour Gin Clear because I hadn't worn it for a while and I was buying the same brand, and I sold the Traska Summiteer because I felt like it had a similar feel to the Mandala. And that more than paid for the Mandala. Now, the third thing is that when I do buy a watch, I try to find it on sale or try to find a good price for it. And usually I'm pretty good about that. There are some instances when something is brand new and I can't wait, but for the most part, if something's been around for a while, I wait for the right price. It's kind of silly, but one of the things I've really taken to heart when it comes to watch collecting and especially watch trading actually came from the TV show Fast and Loud. And in it, one of the main guys always used to say that you make money when you buy, not when you sell. Meaning that if you buy something at the right price, you don't have to wait for the perfect seller in order to make a profit. If you buy it low enough, you can sell it whenever you need to or want to. And because of that, a lot of times I've come close to breaking even when I wind up selling these watches. So, taking that into account and not counting the money that I spent on watches that I made from selling other watches, just because I already spent that money originally on watches, I looked into it and realized that I'm spending about $3,000 per year on average. Number 41. Do you collect anything aside from watches and their associated gear? Which Star Wars movie is your favorite? And what other geeky properties are you into? So for Star Wars, that's easy. Empire Strikes Back is hands down the best Star Wars film ever made. And maybe Return of the Jedi, if you don't count the Ewoks, comes a close second. The newer movies, well, the prequel movies were bad, and the newer movies were bad. I mean, I actually didn't even watch the last one. I just had no interest in it after the second one. In terms of collecting things, I've already mentioned the chess sets, but I also do have some knives and swords. Nothing really serious, just stuff I've gotten over the years. And honestly, I'm not really that into it because I can't really tell you much about them. Most of the time, I buy them just because I like them. Back in the day, like when I was in high school, I used to collect comic books, but haven't done that in a couple of decades. Although, because of that, I used to collect all the Marvel comics. So I'm kind of definitely into the MCU. But kind of again, after Endgame, I haven't really been too interested in what else is coming out. Except for maybe the Loki series. That was pretty good. As for other geeky properties, I'm probably into a lot of things. Read all the Dune books. Also, kind of a big fan of the Dresden series of novels. Monster Hunter International is pretty good too. In terms of movies and TV show, I'd say I'm kind of a Trekkie. Although, again, not necessarily a huge fan of the newer stuff. The J.J. Abrams films were okay, but I just can't really get behind the Discovery show. Just the whole water bear thing just doesn't do it for me. And it seems like they're kind of trying to be something other than Star Trek. Although I have been watching the Lower Decks cartoon that's on Paramount, that's actually pretty good and pretty funny. And then Picard was also a good series. I'm also a big fan of Stargate, both the original series, Atlantis. Stargate Universe started off a little rough, but I think it started getting really good before they canceled it. And that's a property that I really hope they bring back in some form. Number 42. What would be your one watch collection? All these one watch collections are pretty hard for me because I don't really want just one watch, and it's really hard to narrow these things down. For me, I would say that it has to be a nicer sports watch, something kind of tough, durable, something fairly casual, but still could look good when you're dressed up. Since I have a hard time just narrowing it down to one, I have three to give you at three different price points, and two of them I actually already own. The first, and this is on the affordable end, I'd say would be my Champagne Hamilton Khaki King. This watch is practically perfect for this. The only real issue might be its 50 meters of water resistance, but I think that is workable. On the slightly higher end, I'd say look at a Longines Conquest. Now, this is the VHP GMT, and it doesn't necessarily need to be that one, but it is really well made, casual, and I think could be dressy enough. Then on the luxury level, I'd say like an Omega Railmaster or maybe an Omega Aquaterra. Number 43. Do you recommend Kickstarter to buy a watch, or do you think it'd be better to wait for a more refined version 2? Yes and no. This is kind of another tricky one. I wouldn't necessarily wait for, say, a version 2, because usually it's going to be a few years if they even make a version 2. Plus, with a lot of Kickstarter watches, the prototypes have been around the block a bit. They wind up circulating through a lot of reviewers, and those reviewers do give feedback. And if the brand owner is good, he listens to that feedback and may make changes for the production version. So there's already kind of a refinement process as there is. The bigger issue with Kickstarter, and kind of always the issue with Kickstarter, is whether it's worth the slight risk when you jump on one. Most of the time, I'd say it's worth it because you are getting a pretty hefty discount because you're jumping on board early. If it's something you're really interested in and you wait, you're going to spend quite a bit more to get it. And oftentimes it's going to be the exact same watch. So if it's something you love and you really want, then Kickstarter is the best time to get it. And that's what I did say with this mandala. Now, I'd say 95% of the time, maybe higher, like 98% of the time, Kickstarters go off without a hitch. There may be a couple of delays, but in the end, everything's good. But you still have to realize that there's always a remote chance of something going south. And if it does, you're pretty much out of luck. You have no recourse when it comes to Kickstarter. Usually you can minimize this by sticking to brands that have already had successful Kickstarters, but even then, crap can happen, and this year showed that with Hampton. Most of the time, you're going to get a great watch at a great price, but you do need to weigh the odds of something going south. Number 44. What are your long term favorites in your collection and why? One of the things I've recently realized is that a lot of my long term favorite watches are all ones that have unique colorways or really unique designs. Things you don't often see replicated, like my Hamilton Khaki King or my Burgundy Orient Kamasu. Nowadays, you are seeing more red dial divers, and I think the Kamasu is responsible for that. There's also the Orient Star Diver with its very unique design, as well as the Orient Star Outdoor, which is just a terrific all-round watch. Then there's the Kura Wayfarer prototype I have, which I love. I've never seen anything else quite like it, and I doubt I will again. As well as the Second Hour Mandala with its just unique and beautiful design, and then there's always the Seiko Antarctica Monster with its little penguin feet on the dial. I've also really come to appreciate my Longines Conquest GMT. Now, yes, it is a very expensive quartz piece, but it's a great looking, versatile watch, and one that's always accurate. It pretty much lives on my desk, and if I need to go somewhere and I don't have another watch that's wound and set, that's usually the one I grab. Number 45. If you would recommend one quartz watch for EDC that is analog and not radio controlled, what would it be? Well, the Longines I just mentioned. I think that would be a good option, if not a bit of a pricey option. And it doesn't necessarily have to be this one with the GMT. I think the non-GMT is also a good idea, and that's about $700. The only place that I think it falls short is that it still relies on batteries, and I think a great EDC watch would be solar. So for that, and a much more affordable alternative, I'd say like the Citizen ProMaster Diver. Although another option, and I just happened to look over and see it because I have some watches down here that I'm working on, is the Swiss watch company ARC. Swiss watch company just recently sent this to me to check out, and I think it would be a fantastic EDC watch. It's sort of a newer take on the Dirty Dozen. Now, it's not solar, but it's crazy thin, crazy lightweight, and has crazy lume. All right, 46, last question, and that's kind of good because I'm starting to lose my voice a little bit. Any future luxury watch purchases in the works? You're collecting goals, collection ambitions for 2022? Oh, and any thoughts on the Stratton Special Automatic? And this comes from Sean. So my future watch collecting goals for next year and what luxury watches I'm looking at kind of go hand in hand. A couple years ago, kind of before the world went crazy, I was actually planning to sell a number of watches and maybe buy one of those luxury pieces. But then the world went crazy. Who knew what was going on? I started kind of reassessing and thought that maybe that was not the perfect time to do it. My priorities shifted, kind of so to speak. And now I'm kind of looking at it again. But even now, I'm not entirely sure that's the wisest decision to make. So we'll see. But there are a few things that I'm interested in, like, say, a Black Bay, or Tag Monaco, or an Omega Railmaster. I'd also love a Grand Seiko, but I'm not entirely sure which one I'd want to get. The ones that seem to be the most popular are a little more dressy, and I think if I'm going to spend that much on a watch, I want something a little more casual that I'm going to wear all the time. So I'm not sure if I will, but we'll kind of see, because every time I really start to think about it and start to look, I start to question whether that's a wise idea right now, or if I should just kind of keep my money invested. So thinking about it, and I do want to streamline the collection a bit, and that does kind of make sense to sell some and just buy something bigger. But we'll see. As for the Stratton, I hadn't seen this before, and I think it's really cool. The design might be a bit busy, but I do like it. My only real concern here is that they list it as being almost 16 millimeters thick. Now, automatic chronos are always tall, and I can attest to that. And I think the movement that the Stratton's using is kind of similar to this one. But 16 millimeters is still a bit tall. So for me, that's a concern, and I'd be concerned that it might wind up being a bit top heavy because of that, too. But I don't know. I'll have to look into this a little bit more and see if there are any reviews out on it, because it is cool looking. And that does it. Now, if I happen to miss any of your questions or you submitted questions after I recorded this, feel free to ask them below and I'll try to answer there. But that's about it. Just taking a little bit longer than I like. My throat's a little scratchy, but I still thank you for the questions. I thank you for sticking around until the end. And I thank you for watching and making this whole thing possible. So thanks for helping make 4 years of relative time possible. And if I don't happen to get another video out this year, I'll see you in the 5th. Till next time.